I appreciate all showing up. It's so fun to see faces that I know and friends that have been around for a long time. So thanks for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to be a part of this. Want to remind you, if you're not sharing anything verbally, please keep your mic muted. That way it makes it easier for me. So as mentioned, webinar is all about the flipped classroom. And Benjamin so graciously introduced me. If you don't know me, my name is Katie. I live in El Salvador, but I'm not in El Salvador in this moment, so I feel really far away, but I'm glad that through this great Zoom meeting and webinar, we can be close to each other online, which is actually quite a bit about what we're going to be talking about with this flipped classroom. So I'll show you the agenda. Here's what we'll cover in this webinar. First, we'll talk, what is a flipped class? What does it mean to flip a classroom? Then I'll get into the benefits of a flipped classroom, because there are quite a few benefits to this approach. We'll go through some steps of how to start class, if that's something that's possible for you or that you're interested in. Then, of course, we have to address the challenges, because with any new method of teaching, including this one, there are always challenges that we have to try and plan for and see how we could handle them. And then at the end, I'll give you some action steps, things you can do if you want to try and implement this strategy. And we'll finish with some Q&A. So as we're going through, if you have questions, you can throw them into the chat box, or you can hold on to them till the end, and I'll be happy to answer them in that Q&A section. But I'll try and keep my eye on the chat box too, just in case. Okay, so before we get in, I want to take a poll. I'm going to send the poll to your devices, so hopefully you'll be able to see it and answer the poll. The question is, what do you know about the flipped classroom already? Do you know something about this strategy already? You can choose, I'm a classroom flipping expert. Maybe you'll flip your classroom all the time, you know all about it. Have you flipped your classroom before in the past? Maybe you know about it, but you've never tried it yourself. Maybe you've heard about it, but you don't know that much about the strategy. Maybe you've never heard about it at all. So I'll give you just a minute to answer the poll. Or if you want, you can submit your answer in the group chat if you can't see the questions. But it looks like quite a lot of you have heard about it at least, or know a little bit about it. Some of you have flipped your classroom in the past, so you'll be great resources to people with questions in the chat box. And some of you have never heard about it at all, which is interesting. You'll be fresh. I'll share the results with you right now so you can see. Looks like nobody's a classroom flipping expert in this webinar, which is good, because I'm not an expert either. This strategy is a really difficult one to implement consistently. So I'm going to give us some strategies for how to kind of tweak the idea of classroom flipping so that it fits our realities. Okay. So let's start with the first big question. What is a flipped class? What does it mean to flip a class? A flipped class is essentially where students are introduced to new content on their own outside of class. So it's completely flipping the traditional way of how instruction has happened historically. Historically, we give students new class content introduced in class. As teachers, we teach it to them in class. But in a flipped class, the students are introduced to new content outside of class. Then students practice working through the content in class. So instead of going home to practice through worksheets or homework, students use class time to practice. So it's really literally flipping the class, which is why we call it a flipped class, right? So a flipped class is one that inverts that typical cycle of content acquisition and application so that students gain all the necessary knowledge they need before they come to class. And then instructors or teachers guide students to actively and interactively clarify and apply that knowledge during class. So as I mentioned, traditionally, we wait until students come to class to deliver new instruction to the students during class. But in a flipped class, the students learn beforehand the information they need for class. That takes a couple different forms. Some students who have technology in their home might use technology at home, like a virtual classroom, videos, virtual lectures, things like that, in order to study the information on their own at home. Some teachers set up outside of class meetings in different ways, like at libraries or other online interfaces. But essentially the idea is that once the students come to class, they're not using in-class time as time to learn something new. Instead, they're utilizing all the class time to practice and to engage with other students and to have discussions. So it's really flipping the class upside down. I want to mention, I included the reference at the bottom here of the University of Texas at Austin Faculty Innovation Center. They are on the forefront of this strategy. They have a lot of really good resources about flipping classes. I included some of their pictures. I'll show you in a second. If you're interested in learning more, that's a really good place to start. You can just Google UT Austin and the flipped class, and it'll come up with a lot of good resources for you. Okay, so this is those pictures that I wanted to show you from UT Austin that really gets to the heart of how the flipped classroom works. You can see in the bottom left corner, it says before. So the idea is before class starts, before you bring the students into class, students prepare to participate in their class activities by learning the content at home or out of class. This requires that a student has access to that content, which usually is technology. What happens is the teacher will prepare an online video or a lecture, the student will watch and study at home, and all of that happens before class. Then the second step, where it says at the top in the orange section, during class, that's when students practice applying key concepts and they get direct feedback from other students and from the teacher or the facilitator of the class. That in-class portion is important to the strategy because it's when the students actually are applying, creating things, investigating things that they had learned before class on their own. Then after the students have that in-class experience, they go back home or back out of class, wherever that might be, and that's where they can have extension activities, where they can check their understanding, extend their learning. This might look like research projects that they need to do as follow-up. It might be reference materials. It might be collaborative projects online with teachers or students. So essentially the flipped classroom takes the independent pieces that happen and keep them out of class so that the in-class time can be the most interactive and the most applicable for the students. So I'd like to show you a couple more kind of comparisons. It shows on the left what happens in the old or the traditional classroom, and then on the right, what happens after the flip in the new classroom. So typically, in our old traditional ways, before class, students might read over some materials, especially if they have access to a textbook. They might look ahead to see what's coming, but they don't usually do much to prepare for their class. They just kind of show up and to the teacher to deliver whatever it is that's coming for that day. When you flip your classroom, it creates a lot more interaction before class. Students have to complete the interactive learning module, videos or lectures at home, out of class, before they come to class. If they don't complete that work, they'll have no idea what to do during class. It's essential and a part of the process that students engage in that interactive learning before they come to class. So here's that image that shows what happens during class. Typically, or the old way, without flipping your classroom, students might listen to a lecture or engage in learning new material in class. Some people structure this as the I do, we do, you do, right? Of I will teach you something, we're gonna practice it together, and then you can do it on your own at home. That's kind of the traditional way that teachers are delivering instruction in class. But if you flip your classroom, during class is exclusively for students to practice applying the concepts and to directly from teachers. So imagine if you have an hour-long class, and traditionally you have to divide that hour into giving students brand new information and having them apply the information and having them practice and prove that they're able to do all in that 1 hour. With the flip, you use that hour of in-class time only for the practice and the applying. So all the teaching that happens before class, and you can really maximize the amount of time that you spend in class practicing with students and giving them direct feedback. And really, here's what happens after class. Traditionally, students after class go home and do some homework. We assign students homework so that they can extend learning. Like I mentioned, some of us might teach for only 1 hour a day, and there's no way we can fit everything we want into that hour. So we send students home and say, do this homework and bring it back tomorrow, right? But with the flipped classroom approach, students go home and extend and check their understanding in order to complete more complex tasks, excuse me. So it's a more structured after the fact. A lot of teachers who practice a flip strategy, they are the most well-organized teachers because they already know what's coming up. They plan the before class activities, they record the lectures and the videos or whatever they have the students doing before class. They make really clear use of that during class time, structuring collaboration between the students. And then they have a plan for after class that's not just completing a worksheet, but extending the students' learning, having them do some more research or dig deeper into the concepts that they're teaching in the class. Okay, so that was a lot of information of just kind of the basics of the flipped classroom. So I want to give you a minute to run your own, or if you'd like, you can chat box. Have you ever flipped your classroom? And if so, how did you flip it, or how did it go? Was it easy for you? Was it difficult? Where did the students get stuck? Where did they succeed? And if you have never flipped your classroom, why not? Did you just not know that it was possible, or maybe your students don't have access to technology that you need? So take a minute and reflect on your own, or you can share in the chat box. I'm going to look and see in the box. I see someone say, this means that students take more responsibility for their own learning. Definitely. It requires a lot more student responsibility. Someone else started by having their students do the traditional homework in class, and he explained grammar online. Interesting. Oh, some people think their students felt excited. That's a great reflection too. It's definitely a strategy that requires a lot of planning on our part as a teacher. Okay, thanks for contributing. I want to keep moving so we can take a look at these benefits. So as I mentioned, there are a host of benefits for this strategy. People all over the world have used it or tried it or use it sometimes. Some people, this is their exclusive strategy. There are whole classrooms built only on this flipped strategy. So there are some benefits, and there is research constantly being done about it, especially in specific classrooms, teachers action research projects about their own students. So let's get in and see what some of these benefits are. The first benefit to this strategy is that students generally gain a deeper understanding of the content and how to use it. The idea behind this is that if students are spending more time with the concepts and the content, then they're naturally going to gain a deeper understanding. Imagine in this flipped classroom, as I described it, it's requiring them to do a lot of work outside of class. That doesn't take away the work they're doing in class, it just extends it. So they're going to have a deeper understanding of the content naturally after spending that much time before class, during, and after class. The second benefit to the flipped classroom, as reported by teachers, is that students participate more actively. For me as a teacher, some of my struggles when I go to teach something new to my students is that they sit there and they try and take it in. And sometimes it takes a minute for them to process, and I try and check on them and I'll push them a little bit or ask follow-up questions. But some students need more time to process than others. So imagine if you're doing all the new content outside of class through videos or online lectures, those students can rewatch the videos, can do some investigation on their own time and take as much time as they need in order to gain all the understanding of the concepts outside of class, so that when they're participating in class, their participation is much more active. The third benefit that we see from this strategy is that students learn from one another by applying concepts through the community of learning. So because all of that in-class time is spent applying and practicing, students have a lot of time collaborating with each other. So they're learning from each other, they're working together, applying the concepts directly in class. This is a huge benefit, especially for us as English teachers, because admittedly, English teachers like me, we love to talk and we talk and we talk and we get carried away, and then the end of the class comes and we might realize, oh my gosh, I've been talking this whole hour and my students have had no time to talk to each other. So a benefit of this idea of a flipped classroom is that the in-class time eliminates your control time as the teacher to just lecture and lecture and lecture. The students have to collaborate in that time, and that's a great benefit to our students. The fourth benefit, students give and receive more feedback. We know that it's so important for students to have feedback from their peers and from their teacher about how they're learning in class, what content they're gathering. And so by having all of this time before class and during and after class, there's more opportunity to give and receive feedback between teacher and student, or students to students as well. And then finally, as someone mentioned in the chat box, students are accountable for their learning. This strategy puts a large amount of responsibility straight onto the students. It does not work if the students don't do it. So it's difficult at first to put that to release the control, if you will, onto your students and make them accountable for their learning. The learning curve can be really steep. It could be difficult at first, but once students buy in, they're accountable and responsible for their learning. If they are stuck on a concept, it's their job to investigate more, do the pre-class work, reach out for help during that in-class collaboration, right? And then continue to follow through afterwards with the out-of-class activities. So that's kind of a big risk, but with a huge benefit, is once students buy in, then they're completely accountable for their learning, and it puts that ownership in their hands, which generally empowers students as well. And an empowered student is one that's going to be much more successful. Okay, so I want to get into 4 different steps of how to start to flip your classroom. And then we're going to talk about some challenges. So I want to consider that this strategy in our current circumstance that a lot of us are trying to do e-learning and distance learning. Of course, if we were to implement the flipped classroom with fidelity, we would have to have in-classroom time. It's part of the flipped classroom. But I want you to think about how you could adapt this strategy to fit our current situation where many of us are teaching exclusively online. So as I give you these steps are meant for implementing the strategy entirely, but then we're going to talk about how we can adapt it at the end for what we're currently dealing with, since we can't be within 6 feet of our students, right? So the very first step is to first look at your curriculum, look at the resources you have and what you want to teach. Which topics would be better served if students had maximum time to practice and apply? This is the first step to choosing which classes you're going to flip. So when you're transitioning over to a flipped classroom, it's not necessary to flip your classroom every single day. You don't have to constantly have a flipped class. You can if you want, right? But you could just flip one specific class, or maybe one class a month or one class a week. So the idea is that if you first look at your curriculum, look at what you have planned for the semester or the unit or whatever, look for the topics that you want maximum practice time for. The topics that you want students to collaborate the most on. Those are the classes that will be best to flip because it'll give students the maximum amount of time in class to apply their knowledge. Another question to consider is, which topics do you anticipate the students will struggle? If you've taught English for many years, you know that there are certain pieces of our beautiful English language that are really hard for students to grasp the first time. That might be an area that you decide to flip the class. As someone I noticed in the chat box mentioned that he had certain grammar videos that he showed the students before they came to class to kind of prep and prime them before they got into class. That's a great way to start flipping your class. Have students investigate some of that tough grammar before they get to class. So this is the very first step. You have to look at your curriculum and decide which topics could I flip? Which ones will my students struggle with and be the best, the most conducive to flipping? Before I move on, I saw a really great question in the chat box I just want to address. She says, can we use this method for secondary students? Some of them don't have enough vocabulary. What do you recommend? I think you can do this method with any level of students as long as they have the technology at home, right? They're going to need a computer with internet access in order to get access to your online lectures. The same is true regardless of the level of students. If they have lower vocabulary, you're just going to scaffold or differentiate what you do for the pre-class online interactive piece. It's going to look different than if it's a more advanced student, right? So the same way that we interact with first-year students or lower level students different in person than we do online, the same applies. I hope that helps. Okay, so step 2. After we first look and decide which classes we're going to flip, the second step is to plan the application activities. It's really important to examine the in-class activities because that's your only time with students when you flip a class. So you want to maximize that time. Your in-class activity time is not going to be a time where you just let the students free. This is very structured time where students are collaborating. They're not just asking and answering questions about what they learned, right? They have to be examining the concept and applying it in class. So some questions to consider for this step. What activities will challenge students to apply their learning? So the same as when you plan a class, you want to look for activities that bring that higher order thinking in. We don't want students working on a basic level. We want them to be practicing something that's challenging them. And my last question that I just referenced, how can you engage students in higher order thinking skills? If you know about Bloom's taxonomy or the depth of knowledge levels, those are great resources to look at here to make sure that you're not giving students something basic to collaborate on, but you're really challenging them to get deep into the knowledge in class and take it really deep and constructive when they're collaborating with their classmates. Okay, let's see, step 3. Okay, so once you've looked at your curriculum, chosen the class you want to flip, you've planned for those application activities in class, the third step is to prepare the pre-class. This is what happens before the students come to class while they're at home or outside of class. So what you need to do is identify the content that students will use to prepare at home before the in-class session. What new knowledge do the students need to have before they come to class and complete those deeper collaborative activities that you have planned? So one question you could ask yourself is, what essential content do students need to know before the in-class activities? I included the word essential there because this pre-class, before class interaction with the students is not a full-on normal class lecture. It's not going to be you uploading a 2-hour video that the students have to watch and, you know, complete all these activities for. We're looking for the essential content that the students need to know in order to engage in those in-class activities. Lots of teachers for this, lots of teachers who use this strategy, they create short videos, like 3 to 5 videos that are 3 to 5 minutes each. And those videos might be the teacher talking or lecturing, might be, you know, a share screen, might be videos that you find on YouTube that you don't create yourself, that's fine. But you're giving these short videos that get to the heart of the content. Remember that the advantage with videos is that students can watch them again. They can watch them again, and if the video's on YouTube, they'll get recommendations underneath, right? So any amount of support that you give students in those short chunks will be well received from your students as they're learning the content. When I flipped my class, what I like to do is to create a PowerPoint that I record my voice over. If you've never done this before, you can Google it. It's pretty simple to do once you do it the first time. You just create a normal PowerPoint presentation that you might use in class, but record your voice over it and upload it to your class cloud or your platform that you use. That way students can hear your voice, see what you're working on, and kind of get the concepts at home before they come to class. Some teachers prefer to have videos. Whatever works for you, the idea is that you're looking for the essential content that the students need so that they can teach themselves, essentially. They can study and learn the content before they come to class. If that makes sense. Okay. And the final step, if you're starting to flip a classroom, is to plan the extension activities. This is a place where I've noticed that some teachers who flip their classroom, they kind of let slip. If you haven't noticed so far, this process takes a lot of work on the teacher's part. This is a lot more work than the traditional classroom, right? Not only are you planning pre-class lectures and content and recording it and uploading it, but then you're planning in-class materials, in-class activities that students are engaging in, and this extension activity that students have to do after class. So this is often a place where teachers kind of get lazy, honestly, where they think, okay, at home, just review, just summarize, or finish this worksheet, right? But really this extension is an important piece of the plan. It's the place where the students can dive deeper into whatever happened in the collaboration piece. The idea of that in-class collaboration is that they're getting deep into the concepts, and then when they go home after class, they can extend on those concepts at home even more. So you have to prepare your students for the post-class extensions. What are they going to do? Are they going to reflect? Will they create something? Are they going to analyze something deeper or summarize something that they've extended on after the class? That is the time where students are not meant to just kind of, that was nice, let me finish my homework, right? The extension is a big piece of the flipped classroom structure. So consider those 4 steps if you're planning to flip a class. First, look at your curriculum. What areas do you think would be most relevant to flip? Second step, plan the application activities. What will the students do when they're collaborating and applying and practicing in class? The third step is to prepare the pre-class, record your videos or find the resources you're going to share with students so they learn all the content they need. And then finally, plan the extension. What will happen after class? Prepare them for those post-class activities that you want them to extend and engage in. Okay, so as promised, I want to address some of the challenges of this strategy. With our very first poll, I saw some of you have flipped your class and some of you said that you were excited about it. Others of you have heard about the strategy but haven't flipped your class yet. So I'm going to be transparent about what these challenges are so that we know what we're getting ourselves into, right, with this plan. The very first and most basic challenge is students' access to at-home technology. We know students don't always have at-home technology. Where I live in El Salvador, the power is always going out. I'm always losing my internet, which is really frustrating. And so we have to consider those access issues as a challenge to this strategy. Imagine a student goes home to engage in their pre-class activity and something happens, they don't have a laptop, the only phone they have in their family is broken, loses its battery, I don't know. Maybe they go home and there's no electricity and they have no internet, so they can't engage. All of those technology issues will completely destroy the possibility of flipping your classroom. You can't flip a classroom if the student can't complete the at-home portion of the flipped class, right? So that's the very first and really significant issue that we find with a flipped class is the students' access to their technology at home. The second challenge is teacher workload of creating materials. I just described to you the steps that you'd need to take to flip a class, and that is a lot of work. If you're a teacher who has been a teacher for a long time and you're really in the groove, you know how you like to plan and how you like to deliver lessons, it can be really hard to take on this challenge of flipping a class because the workload is so great. Now, instead of just preparing a lesson plan and the resources you need to deliver a class, now you have to prepare all of this technology, all of this engagement that happens before, during, and after class. And that's a challenge. As a teacher, I've been a teacher for a long time and it is tough. Being a teacher is not easy. We all know this to be true. We work all the time. We come to class early, we do extra work, we stay up late, we dream about our students and our classes, right? It's constant. And so adding workload is a big challenge for this strategy. Another challenge that comes up, especially in the research about flipping classes, is that student disengagement happens. If you have a student that doesn't participate in the out-of-class learning, there's no way that student will be successful in this strategy. Now imagine if you have a class of 50 students. If 5 of them don't participate in the out-of-class learning, it's going to bring down the effectiveness for the other 45. So it's a big issue getting students engaged in the out-of-class aspect of learning. This is especially true when we're teaching in a culture where traditionally students just show up to class, expect to be given something, right? They're gathering knowledge, and then they go home and they leave their knowledge at school, right? So engaging them in out-of-class learning, getting them to buy into this idea can be really challenging. It's especially difficult if you don't have the support of your students' parents. So consider that supportive parents and students who care and want to do this are two essential pieces to this flipped puzzle. And without it, you're going to face serious challenges with student engagement. The fourth challenge is teacher buy-in. Some teachers don't want to try it. They don't like technology. They never did. They've been teaching for 50 years and they're going to keep teaching the exact same way they started 50 years ago, right? So it's always difficult to take a new strategy and implement it. Generally, teachers are the most difficult ones to convince. Students are often excited about this. They think that, oh yeah, let me get into these videos at home. That means in class, it's more engaging. We're spending less time just sitting and taking notes and listening, right? But teachers are a little more resistant. So as a teacher, I find that in order to engage other teachers, there has to be a community around this. You gotta do it with someone else who's trying it in their classroom too, so that you have a support system as you're learning to flip a classroom. As I said, you don't have to go all in. You don't have to jump face first into the pool. You can start with one class, a unit, one class a week, one class a month that you're flipping. It doesn't have to be done all at once. But even still, find a class flip buddy. Find a teacher friend who wants to try this also, that you guys can support each other. And then the final challenge that I think is important to note here is that flipping a classroom could isolate English learners and students with special needs, because it's difficult to scaffold or to differentiate for those students. Students with special learning needs need to have lessons differentiated for them. And if they're having to learn at home with an online recorded lecture or a video, there's no way to differentiate for them. You're just expecting them to access the content the same way as all their students in your class. As teachers, we're really good at differentiation in the moment. When we're in class and we see a student struggle, or we know a student who struggles in a certain way, we can adapt our lesson for that student, or we can plan to do it ahead of time. But if all these students are engaging outside of class in the content learning, there's no way to differentiate for them unless you record specific videos, especially for them, or you check in with them one-on-one, and that creates even more work for you as a teacher. So a big challenge is considering those students with special learning needs that we're not leaving behind, right? Okay, whew, that's a lot of flipped classroom information. So I want to give us another poll. I'm going to send it over to your devices. Let's see. The question is, which challenge of the flipped classroom do you think will be most difficult to overcome? And for this poll, you can choose more than one answer if you think there are a few that are similar. Which challenge of the flipped classroom do you think is most difficult to overcome? Do you think student access to at-home technology is most difficult? Do you think the teacher's workload would be the biggest challenge? Student disengagement? Do you think teacher buy-in is most difficult? Or isolating students with special needs? What do you think? You can also type into the group chat. Let me see if I can launch this again so that it goes. I hope you can see it. There we go. Okay. I see a lot of people choosing student access to at-home technology. Yeah, for me, that's a huge one. Like I said, we can't flip a classroom without student access to at-home technology. It's just not going to work, right? I see a lot of you are concerned with isolating your students with special needs. That's definitely a huge concern as well. And no doubt, teacher workload. We're overworked. We are overworked. And so adding all of this other work creating materials adds a lot, puts a lot on our plate. So I'll share the results with you. It looks like student access to at-home technology for sure is the biggest challenge. For me, when looking at this strategy, I consider looking at challenges really essential so that if I'm going to implement it, I know where to start, right? Looking at a flipped classroom in our situation right now, it's especially difficult because a flipped classroom has those three parts, right? The before, the during, and the after class. So if we can't have a during class, then we're gonna have to be really flexible about how we're engaging students in this process. I do want to give you some action steps. Oh, I lied. I want to give you some time to reflect on your own or share in the chat box, if you will. Something to consider is where we are right now in the world. We're talking about this flipped classroom because it's used by a lot of teachers and students online, right? And that's our only way to engage with students right now. So take a second to reflect or share. How could we utilize the flipped classroom strategy specifically during this time of global pandemic? For me, if I'm going to participate in a flipped classroom right now, we're going to have to take the pieces that work for us right now, which to me could be first recording videos for my students with content. So by recording a video or engaging in an online lecture, I can give students access to content that they can watch and rewatch. That is the very first thing that I would do during this time of global pandemic where we can't be close to our students, right? The other thing we can do is create an online community. So that aspect of in-class being where you implement and give time for students to practice, how can we create that online, right? We can engage with platforms that have forums where students can chat with each other. We could set up collaboration groups or times where students can collaborate with each other. It's definitely something to consider as you're pulling pieces of this strategy for what could work with us right now. If you were in my webinar this morning, we talked about some resources to use to engage with students in e-learning, different platforms. The Richmond Learning Platform is a beautiful one. The Santillana Compartir, if you have access to that. A lot of people are familiar with Schoology, or Google Classroom, or Edmodo. Some people have Facebook just for their students, Facebook groups. So consider, even though we can't implement this flipped classroom with fidelity right now, what pieces can we pull to try out while we're in this pandemic of e-learning? Okay, so I do want to give you some action steps of what we can do now that we have this information about a flipped classroom. The first one, adapt the strategy. We can't flip our classrooms according exactly to the strategy right now, right? But we can adapt the strategy to fit our needs for what we're doing, as I just mentioned. You can create content videos. There are so many fun teacher YouTubers in the world. I'm sure that many of you follow them or have used them in your classroom. If you are someone who likes to create videos or you're good at technology, create content videos for your students. It's a great way to utilize your time right now, especially if you're not teaching full-time. Imagine if you create a content video, one video a week or one video on the weekend, right? That content video you can use for the rest of your career as a teacher. You'll always have that video of you teaching that content, and you can use it as a follow-up for students as they're struggling with that content in the future. Especially as English teachers, we teach the same stuff over the course of our career, right? So if you have a content video that you've created, that's yours forever, and you can share it with your students forever. Your third action step is to encourage online collaboration. Collaborate with your students online if they have access to technology, especially right now in this time where anxiety is running really high. It's a really strange, difficult time for us across the world. So encouraging your students to collaborate online in those forums or groups or chats is a great way to get them engaged. So these action steps, remember, are baby steps. We don't have to go all in to flipping a classroom all at once. You can take baby steps, implement pieces of this strategy, make it work for you and your students. Be patient with yourself and with your students during this time, because all of these, e-learning and distance learning and the situation we're in globally is new. It's all uncharted territory. So be patient with yourself. Take a baby step or two. Start with one of these action steps if you'd like, in order to implement your flipped classroom strategy. So before we finish up, I want to send you one last poll. That will ask, which action step will you take towards flipping your classroom? So think about this information that I gave you about flipping your classroom and choose an action step. Which one do you want to try? Do you want to try and adapt the strategy? Do you want to try and create some content videos? Do you want to try and encourage your students to collaborate online? What is your action step? I see lots of people wanting to create content videos. That's so awesome. I see some YouTubers in the crowd. Definitely take some time to adapt the strategy for what works for you. I know Richmond's Academic Learning Center, everyone who works for Richmond, including me and Benjamin, are available to help, to provide support if you need it. I just recorded a tutorial for Richmond Learning Platform, and I know there are other tutorials online for different platforms you can use to try and adapt the strategy to the platform that you're using with your students. So consider that as well. Okay, it looks like we got quite a few people in here on the poll. So I'll share the results with you. Yeah, 30 of you want to create content videos. So I'm gonna be looking on YouTube for your content and see if I can share it with my own students. That's awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention and for sharing with me the action steps that you're gonna take with this strategy. As I said, it's a strategy that can be really useful to do baby steps, one step at a time, right? One class at a time. Now that you know exactly how to implement the strategy, you can adapt it for what you need in this time that we're distance learning with our students. But keep it in mind, I like to call these kind of webinars like back pocket tricks, right? Maybe this isn't relevant for you right now if your whole classroom situation has been shut down, but do some more research, some more investigating about the flipped classroom to see if it could be something that you can do in the future. Something that you can implement piece by piece, get your students involved in, right? I want to share with you while we're looking at the chat box. I want to share with you this survey link that will help us out at Richmond and Santana a lot if you would take some time to complete a feedback survey. It helps us know what you think about this kind of interactive webinar and what to plan for the next one. If you have any more questions, I'm going to keep a look on the chat box. It looks like Benjamin just put the link in there for you. I appreciate you so much for joining me this afternoon for this webinar. I hope it was helpful. I hope that you're staying safe and healthy and that your students are safe and healthy and you can implement some new strategies into your e-learning practices. So thanks, everybody.